Hello again, and welcome to another video by me, Alex from AdoredTV. Today we'll be taking a look at a graphics card, and with the improving graphics card market, you might actually be able to buy this card at some point in the near future for around MSRP. So instead of jumping right into the card in question I'm reviewing today, I kind of want to address the title of the video and talk about something I'm sure that we're all really quite tired of hearing. The price of a GPU. Well, unfortunately, prices haven't gotten close to MSRP, but they have dropped from the extreme prices a few months ago. As others like Hardware Unboxed have covered, availability has gone up and pricing has gone down, with scalpers less active on eBay and cards for once not immediately selling out online. Although buying cards directly from AMD is still nearly impossible to pull off, since those cards sell at MSRP, since those are quite often sold by scalpers on the secondhand market. AIBs, though, have jacked up their prices significantly due to the demand, which I don't blame them for. It's an odd business decision to sell cards lower than half of what people are willing to pay for it. With the exception of EVGA on the Nvidia side, and a few models here and there, I've seen most have jumped up pricing, especially on the 6700 XT. And $1,000 is a lot of money for a mid-tier graphics card. While 12 gigs of GDDR6 isn't cheap, this is a 40 CU card. It wasn't all that long ago that 36 CU cards were selling for around $200 to $300. The die size on a 6700 XT is about 45% larger than a 480. And with the costs rising due to tariffs, supply chain strain, and demand, I don't know how long, if ever, we'll see these cards hit a sub $600 price point. But on to the matter at hand. The card in question I am reviewing today is an ASRock Phantom D RX 6700 XT 12 gig OC. This is a successor to last generation's 5700 XT. This card has 12 gigs of VRAM, which is a 4 gig bump from last generation, with a smaller memory bus but is using much faster memory. 2000 MHz versus 1750 on last gen. And this card has the same number of shaders and is a 40 CU card, which is the same as last gen's 5700 XT. This card specifically is a triple slot behemoth that uses a triple fan cooling solution with a smattering of RGB LEDs and also has an ARGB header, which can be used to sync with the rest of your system, with an RGB fan in the middle and the Phantom Gaming logo being lit up as you can see here. The card uses ASRock's Phantom Gaming design, which is black with silver and red highlights. The card also has a high-quality backplate. It features 3 DisplayPort 1.4 ports and a single HDMI 2.1, which I strongly prefer over multiple HDMI. I believe this is also what the standard reference board provides. The card also requires a dual 8-pin power cable and a switch to turn off the RGB if need be. If you're interested in a teardown and an overview of the PCB components, Tech PowerUp did one that will be linked below. With this card being a loaner, I was uncomfortable doing a full teardown, but let me know if you'd like to see one in the future. Finally, this card also has a rather significant OC to 2448 MHz over 2424 MHz for the reference. Now, a word from our sponsor. So, since the price of hardware has been skyrocketing, you just might be looking for a way to save some money on your build. Our sponsor today, cdkeyoffers.com, has a way to solve that. You can use code ADORE, ADORE, to pick up a Windows 10 key or some of the other products they sell, like game keys and Microsoft Office. After you order the key, give it a bit and it'll be delivered almost instantly. Finally, that pesky Windows is not activated watermark is gone, and voila, you can put on whatever wallpaper you want. Just make sure you copy and paste the code. Give it a minute or so to activate the key, and once it's done, you should be good to go. That's, again, our sponsor today, cdkeyoffers.com. Remember, if you want to save 20%, use code ADORE, ADORE. So, normally, I don't do graphics card reviews, and I'd like to know what you, the viewer, thinks about the games tested, the methodology, or what else you would like to see in the future. So, with that out of the way, let's move next on to the testing methodology and the goals here. So today I've got the previous generation 5700 XT, Nvidia's last generation 2080 Founders Edition, going up against the ASRock Phantom D RX 6700 XT OC. I tested a handful of games at 1080p and 1440p. Also, Smart Access Memory is on for all of these tests here. The CPU used is a Ryzen 5 5600X on an Asus X570 Hero, a 3600 MHz CL14 kit of G.Skill RAM, and a 750 watt EVGA PSU. In our first test, we have Control, which was tested at high settings. For 1080p results, you see a 12% lead over the 2080 and an almost 20% difference between the last generation 5700 XT. At 1440p, the gap gets closer with a 9% gap between the 2080 and the 6700 XT, and a 20% margin over the last generation 5700 XT. Moving on to Cyberpunk, we see a massive gain between last generation and this 6700 XT is about 40% faster than the 2080 on average and 30 in the 99th percentile. And it's 70% faster than the 5700 XT. This is a massive gain, and it's one of the most outstanding differences you'll see today. Moving over to 1440p, you'll see a much more understandable 20% jump over the 2080 and a 50% jump over the 5700 XT. Probably the most shocking results I've seen today. Moving on to Doom Eternal, this was tested at the Ultra preset. Starting at 1080p, we see just under a 20% margin between the 6700 XT and the 2080 on average, and the 99th percentile. It's also just under a 30% gap over the previous 40 CU GPU, the 5700 XT, on average, and just over 33% with the 99th numbers being quite similar to 1440p. Next on to Forza Horizon 4, we tested high settings in the in-game benchmark. We see a 40% improvement in performance over the 5700 XT on the average, and an even larger 50% jump on the 99th at 1080p, and a 24% improvement over the 2080 on average, and a 26% improvement on the 99ths. Now looking at the 1440p numbers, we see the 6700 XT is the only card capable of doing over 144 FPS here consistently, and it extends its lead over the 5700 XT to 50% on average, and remains in the 99th percentile as well. 2080 is still trailing here by almost 35% on average, but remains close to 25% on the 99th, just sticking over 120 FPS. Gears Tactics, things get a bit tighter here, but this tends to be a more CPU-dominated game. We see the average sticks just below 144 FPS on the 6700 XT, with the difference between the 2080 being about 10% slower. The 5700 XT trails in average FPS by about 20% itself. Moving over to 1440p though, the 6700 XT is 20% faster than the 2080, and the 5700 XT trails by just under 35%. Taking a look at Ghost Recon Breakpoint at 1080p again, the 6700 XT extends at around 40% faster on both cards. Oddly enough, the 2080 and the 5700 XT are at near parity here in performance at 1080p. The gap extends just a bit between them at 1440p, though with the gap being about 35% and 44% respectively. The next title we have here is Hitman 2, which was tested at high settings in DX12. The 2080 is only being beat by under 15%, while the 5700 XT is being beat by 23% on average. The minimums here are pretty close, and only a few percent between all of them. Now on to 1440p, you see a 22% gap and a 34% gap between the cards. Taking a peek at Red Dead Redemption 2, we have tested at high settings on the in-game benchmark. The 6700 XT is over 30% faster than the 2080 on average, and about 21% on the minimums, with the 6700 XT sitting at about 140 FPS on average. The 5700 XT actually performs a slight bit faster here compared to the Nvidia card, but still gets beat by over 30%. At 1440p, the gap gets pretty wide at 63% between the 2080 and the 6700 XT. The 99th percentile is around the same as well. The 6700 XT is almost beaten by twice the performance here, and honestly, I didn't expect the gap to be this wide, but I did make sure to test it multiple times. Finally, in our last game today, Shadow of the Tomb Raider, for this we tested at high settings on the in-game benchmark. 6700 XT leads the 2080 and the 5700 XT by 32 and 49% respectively. As for the 99th percentile, it's a jump of 15 and 30%. So, moving on to temperature testing, I test at 50% fan speed during a 30-minute loop of the Hitman 2 benchmark, and get a peak temperature during the run. As we can see here, this is the coolest card in the lineup and was particularly quiet in comparison, although most modern cards today are very, very quiet. And this seems to be true of most 6700 XTs, but noise testing wasn't a particular focus here, since we don't have a ton of comparative data, and I'm unsure how many GPUs we'll be getting as time goes on. But please let me know in the comments for any sort of temperature and noise testing that you'd like to see. I'm personally aiming more towards using audio recordings of the fans themselves, since decibel meters can be kind of unreliable for actual noise profiles. Overall, the Phantom D performed really well in the games that I've tested today, and aside from the pricing, the build quality on the cooler was not the most exotic thing, but it did quite well. It also features a nice metal backplate, and is one of the higher clock cards that are currently available. This is reportedly one of the few AIB models that are faster than the reference card, which is impressive on ASRock's part, as they've done a really good job bouncing from a relatively new contender in the GPU market to having very strong offerings. Since testing was done a few weeks ago, I didn't test FSR, but that software is still in its infancy, and for the software suites in general, it's a bit of pick your poison, as AMD has Radeon Chill, which NVIDIA has no counter, and NVIDIA has the better recording quality, DLS is in more titles, and so on and so forth. In terms of performance, it's about where a 2080 should be, and it's a massive improvement over the 5700 XT. Perhaps enough so to justify to upgrading from one. It's got enough gas to do 1080p 144Hz, and maybe even 240 if you lower settings or you're looking at esports titles, and it's a strong contender for 1440p 144Hz. For those who think a 3070 is a bit too much and a 6800 XT is overkill, this is a really good option. And even for its price compared to other cards, the street price actually isn't that bad. At $1,000 from a card that is sold and shipped by Newegg and not some third-party seller, this isn't the worst offender out there, while still being a relatively solid option that is generally in stock and is currently Newegg's #1 selling graphics card. But $1,000 for a 6700 XT, which is supposed to retail at $479, is hard to swallow. So if you're desperate for a card and, say, are still sitting on a 480 or a 970, this is a significant upgrade if you need something new. You can grab the cheaper ASRock model, the Challenger D dual fan model. But honestly, it's hard for me to actually recommend a 6700 XT right now. If you really need to buy something, this might be a decent option if you've waited this long. You might be able to wait it out another month or two, though. But hopefully in the coming months, prices will normalize a bit, and those watching in the future might want to know what I think about this card. Well, it's a fair bit faster than the 3060 Ti, and it's probably worth another $50 or so if you aren't particularly looking for any of NVIDIA's RTX features and are happy with AMD's equivalents. It sits more in line with the 3070 in general, and as you'll likely see in the video Donnie's got coming soon. That being said, I'd still be looking at a 6080 if availability gets better, as currently you can get a 6700 XT for around $1,100 to $1,200, and the 6800 XTs are out of stock at $1,200 to $1,300. So, all in all, I was quite impressed with ASRock's implementation of the 6700 XT, and I think it's a fine addition to any build if found for the right price. So let me know in the comments if you guys have any thoughts about this card, where you think the GPU market is, and if you'd like a video where I kind of break down my thoughts on where I think the market's going and what pricing might be like in the next few months. Please make sure to comment, like, and subscribe. Check out our Patreon if you want to join our Patreon-only Discord, where you can get access to us, and check the merch store.